Welcome once more to the Design Materials channel. This is Edson Mafuz, architect and professor of architectural design at School of Architecture, Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Porto Alegre, Brazil. I'm back with another video on architectural design. This time to talk about some aspects of facade design. If you haven't seen it yet, I suggest watching the video that deals with the evolution of the facade in the 20th century, the one uploaded just before this one. Every practicing architect knows that solving facades is a very difficult task, no matter how much experience one has. Therefore, students are more than justified in their anxiety about the subject. What follows is a series of reflections on some choices that can and must be made when we have to decide what a facade will be like. It would be impossible to mention all the themes and their alternatives. Therefore, I will limit myself to mentioning and commenting on some topics that seem relevant to me and that deserve to be explored in other moments. It is also worth remembering that the facade is a three-dimensional element with thickness, and it should not be confused with its two-dimensional counterpart, the elevation. Since the very first buildings were built, there must have been a concern with the appearance of the building's vertical boundaries. But it is from the Renaissance that the facade becomes an important element of any project. Remember that at that time, any important building was a typologically predetermined masonry box, covered with historical elements of Greco-Roman origin, which aimed to endow the building with unity and proportional relationships. The superficial layer This superficial layer was extremely important, as it was the means of establishing connections with the past and with what was considered to be the structure of the world. The microcosm reflected the macrocosm. At the outset of the Renaissance, the beginning of a more careful treatment of the facade, by the hand of an architect who had worked with Alberti in Florence, Bernardo Rossellino. In San Andrea, Alberti combines a temple front with the triumphal arch motif to solve the facade of a church organized as a longitudinal nave and side chapels. In San Giorgio Maggiore, Venice, Palladio superimposes two temple fronts to create the facade of a plan that consists of three parallel naves. In order to accomplish that, he had to adapt the language inherited from Rome. So important was the appearance of buildings that, in the middle of the 17th century, a kind of contest was held to solve the facades of the Louvre in Paris, with Bernini being one of the invited Italian architects. Unfortunately, none of the projects were built. In England, in the following centuries, the concern with the quality of the facades passed from the isolated building to the blocks that materialized the many urban projects that characterized Georgian London. In some cases, the solution was to distribute the same elements over very extensive facades. But soon, architects started to introduce rhythms and centralities in facades the size of an entire block. In Knightsbridge, there are two rhythms, that of the access porches and that of the salient bays that interrupt the continuity of the upper floors. In Bedford Square, one of the houses receives special treatment to emphasize one of the axes of the square. The same thing happens on the four sides of this marvelous square. If we accept that the beginning of a greater concern with the treatment of facades occurs in the Renaissance, as the centuries went by, the importance of this aspect of architecture diminished, to the point that, in Durand's treatise of extreme influence in the 19th century, solving the facade was the last step in the project sequence, he thought. Here we see this drawing in which he explains his method of design. And the numbers indicate the place given to the facade, which is number 7, that is the last step in a sequence. At least conceptually, using a curtain wall seems to be an easy option, as it is a repetitive and homogeneous global solution. But whoever decides so soon realizes that this type of facade implies a series of other themes and problems that need to be solved. As in architecture, there is no progress in the sense that existing strategies become obsolete as new ones are invented. The independence allowed to the facades from the beginning of the last century does not imply that the traditional opaque facade with openings cut out is no longer a valid alternative. Thus, if we do not consider the applied ornament, there is not much difference between the design process of this English mansion and this university building by Alvar Aalto. There are situations in which, for reasons of privacy, orientation, or climate, one has to revert to the stage when there is much more wall than openings. One could think that the opaque versus open theme is limited to the traditional facade, but it pertains also to Le Corbusier's free facade and the ribbon window. And if we add the thickness of the facade to the theme, the equation becomes a little more complex. The possibility of total glazing also depends on the use of the building. Offices lend themselves to this more easily than residential buildings. The repetition of the same element over long stretches of facade can generate monotony, as we saw in the Park Crescent example, and as Arne Jacobsen himself tacitly recognized by not completely repeating the facade system used in Rodovre. At St. Catherine's College, he introduced a second rhythm that made a facade of more than 100 meters not monotonous, and he did so by making the party walls apparent, what also served to make very evident the 3.2-meter module that controls the whole project inside and outside. The way in which the facade relates to the resistance structure is another very important theme that results in numerous design situations. The three clearest situations are total independence between the two systems and the subordination of one of them to the other. In this example, by right, the structure follows the configuration of the space. In this one by Le Corbusier, structure and spatial order are independent from each other. And in the one by Kahn, the spatial configuration follows closely the order of the structure. In the 1920s and 30s, the structural grid has become one of the expressive resources that filled the void left by the abandonment of historical styles. Essentially, the grid defines the building's exterior planes. Only then can it have visibility. When the walls coincide with the grid or are very close, this relationship becomes the place of solutions that can be very complex, as seen in the Casa del Fascio, whose facades are so complex that it took an entire book by Peter RYTHM to decipher them. Interestingly, there is a return to the theme of open versus closed when thinking about how to fill in the grid modules. There seems to be a need to anchor both the openings and the opaque panels to the elements of the grid, otherwise they will float within each rectangular area. Not the case here. Kahn's example draws attention to the fact that resolving a facade has to do with creating a system that can absorb variations and internal needs without appearing to be disorganized. Small setbacks give the facade three-dimensionality and facilitate the relationship between different materials. Larger setbacks generate intermediate spaces and serve as some protection strategies. In the hands of good architects, the manipulation of the grid can generate solutions of great visual interest. In this case, the reduction of the grain of the grid towards the top of the building, which in a way contradicts structural logic, introduces variety into the system. Furthermore, the fact that the gridded facade constitutes a large beam allows the cantilevers at both ends of the building. Another interesting theme is the predominant direction of the facade: vertical, horizontal, or neutral. In Chicago, in the second half of the 19th century, all one wanted to do was to go up. Therefore, emphasis on the vertical, a criterion that, since it is not linked to any style, can reappear in the historicism of the 1980s or in some more qualified contemporary architecture. At the German embassy, the emphasis is decidedly horizontal. In the other two buildings, horizontal elements are highlighted as a counterpart to the verticality inherent in the size of the buildings. Aldo Rossi's project is a perfect example of neutrality as it is a perfect cube. That is to say that no direction predominates. Besides, the square windows are located at the same distance, both horizontally and vertically, thus emphasizing the building's non-directional character. The protection of facades against environmental aspects has been going on for centuries. In Galicia, a region of Spain characterized by humidity, it is common to build double facades, creating a shallow space that mitigates the problem. The outer layer is usually composed of checkered panels painted in white. But the most common kind of protection is against excessive sun and glare. The standard solution for south and west facades is to use horizontal and vertical elements respectively. External blinds are widely used, based on Spanish examples of the 1950s and more recent ones. Another way to protect a facade is to employ movable panels that can be positioned where and when needed. The result of using this alternative is really dynamic facades, as the total configuration of the panel set is never the same. More recently, metal sheets, perforated or expanded, started to be used as sun protection, as well as perforated concrete panels, almost always in static solutions. But traditional solutions are being reinvented and continue to be applied. Some light and renewable, such as Spanish external blinds and awnings, and others that involve permanent construction elements, such as the use of hollow ceramic or concrete components, and the setting back of openings to take advantage of the thickness of the facade. Until a century or so ago, it was not thought that the facade should reveal what was happening behind it. See the case of Palazzo Farnese in Rome, in which a homogeneous and repetitive facade does not reveal the variety of interior spaces that it limits. In modern architecture, there are cases of all kinds. Clear revelation, as in the aux Enfants house, in which the painter's study is revealed by the large windows and skylights. Total opacity, like in the Cook house on the right. Here one has no idea what goes on behind the facades. Or subtle articulation of the interior, as in Yale, in which Kahn interrupts the second floor beam to indicate the position of a double height space, the library of the institution. At the University of Jyväskylä, Aalto seems to want to indicate that there are a number of rooms that are of equal size and some of different size in use. The treatment of the last floor is intriguing. Are these special spaces, or is it a reference to the way of finishing a building characteristic of traditional architecture, which is usually called crowning? In Marseille, Le Corbusier tries to minimize the impact of a very repetitive facade by painting the interior of some balconies in primary colors, perhaps thinking of facilitating the orientation of residents. In a more picturesque architecture, the fragmented volume exempts one from having to think of the facade as a single piece, but imposes the establishment of some kind of relationship between its parts. There are many cases in which the facade design does not express anything that happens inside, either because the pattern of openings is random, like in the Sanaa building here, or because its configuration adopts features that are not usually architectural. The result often obscures the reading of the object as a building. A constant concern for students and many architects is to provide their buildings with movement, as if this were possible. For this, they adopt irregular configurations of their openings, which try to appear random and which are in fact arbitrary in the bad sense of the term. If the enemy is a supposed monotony of the facades, it is possible to avoid this with solutions in which mobile elements, activated by the users when necessary, configure different facades at all times. If the purpose is to provide the facade with some variety, the simple alternation of the position of the opaque and open parts can create a very pleasant result. The corners are a topic that deserves further investigation. In these two palaces, the internal corner is treated in opposite ways. At the Farnese, each facade ends with its own support and an additional element is introduced to connect them. At the Strozzi, two facades share the same pillar. The same multiplicity of solutions just suggested are also true to the external facades, be they traditional or modern, as can be seen by going through a sample of the solutions created by Mies van der Rohe for the corners of his buildings. In another context, I stated that in some cases, such as the architecture produced by the so-called Paulista school, the definition of the resistant structure and the spatial configuration happened at the same time. Once the structure was defined, the project was practically ready. This is the case with works that use prefabricated structures. In these situations, there is no specific step in which the facades are designed, or more precisely, everything is taught at the same time, and there are no decisions that do not affect all subsystems. Therefore, the facade seems to appear as if by magic at the end of the process. Thanks very much for watching one more video. I hope you liked and I hope you come back for more.